be screwed. Feel my own adrenaline, yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 46th part of, What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Hello. Harry said cautiously to the strange creature before him. Harry Potter, the being cried in a high-pitched voice. Long, so long, has Dobby wanted to meet you, sir, such an honor it is. Harry narrowed his eyes. Another rabid fan. And you are? He prompted warily, his wand sliding into his hand from its holster. Weren't the spells on the Weasley homestead set to only allow friends to pop in? Dobby, sir, said the house elf. Harry nodded. And what can I do for you? He asked cautiously. The creature stared at him, stunned. Do for me, he cried. Never never ever has anyone. The elf burst into tears, bawling loudly. Harry sighed. Dobby was worse than any of the fangirls, or fanboys, he had met at Hogwarts. They usually just blushed bright red and ran away. This was going to take a while. Unfortunately, the tree leaves hit him from the sky, so Ginny wouldn't be able to spot and rescue him. He sighed and dropped down to sit cross-legged on the ground. Please, sit down, said Harry politely. The elf choked and sobbed even more. Never never has a wizard asked Dobby, lowly Dobby, to sit down like an equal. Harry sighed. Knowing wizards and witches, he could easily believe that was true. He patiently waited. With a twist of his wrist and a flex of his fingers, the wand shot back into the holster. Dobby managed to calm himself as he slowly lowered himself to the ground. He sat hiccuping, with his great eyes fixed on Harry in an expression of watery adoration. He took a deep breath. Dobby must tell you, sir, it is hard, sir. Dobby doesn't know where to begin. The beginning is always best, my mum tells me, Harry said dryly. Dobby shook his head slowly. Suddenly, he jumped up and started banging his head furiously on a nearby tree, shouting, Bad Dobby! Bad Dobby! Stop! Stop that! What are you doing? Harry hissed, springing up and pulling Dobby back. The elf was slightly cross-eyed, and staggered a bit. Dobby has to punish himself, sir. Dobby almost spoke ill of his family, sir. Your family? Harry said suspiciously, scowling, not liking how the elf seemed to regard his family. Or his duty to that family. Dobby serves a family, sir. Dobby is a house elf bound to serve that family forever. Do they know you're here? Asked Harry carefully. The house elf shuddered and looked at him, horrified. No, sir. Oh, no. Dobby will punish himself most grievously, indeed, for being here, sir. Dobby will have to slam the oven door on his ears for this. If they knew, sir. He shuddered again. Harry frowned, puzzled, but won't they notice if you do that? He shook his head sadly. Dobby doubts it, sir, the house elf responded frankly. Dobby always has to punish himself for something, sir. They lets Dobby get on with it, sir. Sometimes they reminds me. Harry shook his head angrily. He knew that house elves were trapped in a symbiotic relationship with their families. The only way a house elf could leave would be if the family wanted him or her to leave. Fortunately, only the family head could dismiss an elf by giving them clothes, so an angry child couldn't dismiss the family elf in a fit of pique. Unfortunately, though, a few families took advantage of that fact to mistreat the small servants. His mum and the princesses took great care that their elves were well treated, as they should be. The only disagreements were in preventing the little housekeepers from going overboard and tackling too much work. For a house elf to disobey his family was almost impossible. Dobby's family's treatment of him must be extremely severe if he was willing to suffer more abuse from them by going against their desires. Only a very mentally unstable elf would act against his own family. Eyeing the weeping elf, Harry knew this elf had to be severely unstable. It would be best to treat him as carefully as possible. After living with the Dursleys, Harry could sympathize with the house elf. Sometimes, Harry wasn't so sure of his own mental health. Sometimes he had difficulty remembering he was a good pony. Today's venture into the ministry had been a bit too stressful, he admitted to himself. He sighed. "So, why are you here?" he asked, rubbing his forehead. Once more sitting, Dobby leaned forward, his eyes almost as big as a lorry's headlights. Dobby heard, he whispered hoarsely, that Harry Potter met the Dark Lord a second time just weeks ago, that Harry Potter escaped, again. Harry nodded. "But my mum and Headmaster Dumbledore were also there," he said. He shuddered as he remembered what had happened. "I almost didn't survive," he whispered reluctantly. The house elf's eyes shone with tears. "Ah, sir," he gasped. He wiped his face on the grimy pillowcase he wore. Brave is Harry Potter. So many dangers has he already defied. But Dobby has come to Harry Potter, to protect him, and warn him. Even if Dobby shuts his ears in the oven door, later. He sat up straight and stared at Harry. "Harry Potter must not go back to Hogwarts," he ordered. Harry sat still for a moment as what the elf had said soaked into his mind. Then he laughed sardonically. "Not gonna happen," he said, shaking his head. "The princesses want me to go to Hogwarts I will go," he said dutifully. He shrugged. "Besides, if Dumbledore let anything happen to me, Mum would toss him in Tartarus." He paused a second. "Or Celestia would banish him to the moon for 1,000 years. He grinned wryly. "Or Mum would toss him into the dungeons and then Celestia would banish him to the moon." "No, no, no," Dobby squeaked emphatically. His ears flapped like an elephant's as he violently shook his head. "Harry Potter is too good, too great, to risk. Harry Potter must stay home. He will be in mortal danger at Hogwarts," Dobby said in a dire tone. "Mortal danger," repeated Harry. Even with Voldemort at Hogwarts last year, it had been the safest Harry had ever been. Something had only tried to kill him 2 times in 10 months. That would have been a record for Equestria. There, the He and Cutie Mark Crusaders ran into life-threatening situations at least once a month. That couldn't begin to compare to the regular beatings the Dursleys gave him. "A plot, Harry Potter, there is a most deadly plot," the house elf whispered conspiratorially. "Terrible things will happen at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry this year." Dobby was trembling so greatly he almost fell over. "For months, sir, Dobby has known. Harry Potter is too important, sir. He must not go to Hogwarts." Immediately attentive, Harry asked, "What things? Who's plotting them?" He stared at the house elf angrily. Dobby jumped up and ran headfirst into a tree, backed up, and did it again. "Right. Right!" Harry cried, lunging forward as he once more grabbed the elf. "I get it, you can't tell me. But why are you warning me?" Almost as soon as he said it, he knew. He slyly smiled. "This has to do with you-know-who, doesn't it?" Dobby turned to look at the tree. Again. "Wait. Just nod or shake your head," he quickly said. Slowly, Dobby nodded his head. "Well, it can't be too serious, then, can it? Just this morning I tossed the wraith that was Tom Riddle, you-know-who, Voldemort, through the veil of death in the ministry," Harry said confidently. "He's all sorted." Dobby stared at him, wide-eyed, and whispered, "Harry Potter is truly great." Then he shuddered. "But, danger still bees at Hogwarts. Harry looked away for a moment and sighed deeply. Dobby, I have to go to Hogwarts. Everyone wants me to go to Hogwarts. The princesses, my mum, Headmaster Dumbledore, Minister Fudge. Even if I didn't want to go to Hogwarts, they would make sure I did. He shook his head. No pony, or house elf, can fight an entire world by himself. He took a deep breath. Besides, my herdmates will be there. I won't let them get hurt. Not to mention my friends. What kind of friend would I be if I left them to face the danger and never did anything to help them? He asked reasonably. But, Harry Potter, sir, Dobby's voice was barely above a whisper. There be powers that no decent wizard knows. Dobby bounded up again, and dashed, head first, into the tree. Harry again tackled the crazed elf. Sorry, Dobby, but I can't abandon my herdmates and friends. I promise, I'll be extra careful. And I'll tell both Dumbledore and my mum what you said. He held the elf at arm's length. You've done what you set out to do, warned me. Now let me do what I have to do. Please. Dobby stared at him. Now, go back to your home. Don't punish yourself over this, you haven't done anything requiring punishment, Harry said firmly. He let go of the house elf. Dobby looked at him uncertainly, then disappeared. Harry sighed and stood up. He brushed his hand across the bottom of his trousers and started towards the Quidditch pitch. He would have to think carefully about what he would tell his herdmates. If he wasn't careful, they would be all over this, trying to solve the mystery. He carefully set it aside in his mind and waved at the Pegasus practicing flying through the Quidditch hoops without touching them, snapping her wings closed at the last possible instant. Ginny thoroughly enjoyed having Harry's attention the rest of the afternoon and evening, even if Ron did insist that they play several of games of chess after dinner. Ginny sat beside him and held his hand. Between the two of them, they made Ron work for his victories. Harry was slowly coming to terms with the concept that all 5 of his herdmates wanted to be herdmates. It still boggled his mind. Unfortunately, he had no idea of how to be a herdmate back. He certainly didn't want to do anything that they might misinterpret as meaning he didn't like them. However, holding hands seemed to be something they liked, and hugging. But ponies always hugged each other, anyway, so how was that different between herdmates and others? Kissing snogging they said here seemed lots more complicated. Kissing on the cheek, like he did with his mum, was one thing. The full-on snogging he had seen in the Gryffindor common room, on the other hoof, made him uncomfortable. What did they expect him to do? Or not to do? It was dreadfully confusing. Neville Longbottom's birthday party on Thursday was the day before his, and was scheduled to last from just after lunch until just before dinner. Cake and ice cream would be in the middle of the afternoon so that the children could work off that extra sugar energy before dinner. Unfortunately, the afternoon party at the Longbottom estate was awkward. Harry made his normal, humiliating flu entrance by sliding across the marble floor as a unicorn, and barely missed knocking Neville down. Why he had turned into a unicorn, he wasn't sure. His 4 hooves weren't any more effective at slowing him down than sliding on his trousers would have been. Neville, who had never seen Harry use the flu, stared wide-eyed and incredulous, then burst out laughing. His grandmother, MDM Longbottom, kept her amusement to a smile as he changed back to a person, blushing deeply. She welcomed Harry warmly as his herdmates arrived in a more dignified manner. Neville escorted them to the ballroom hosting the party, where they dropped off their presents at the table reserved for that. It was supposed to be Neville's 12th birthday party. Regrettably, he spent most of the time in the beginning just introducing Harry to his guests' parents. From Ginny's and Hermione's reactions, Harry got the impression that parents didn't usually stay during children's parties. Poor Neville. Sidelined on his own birthday for politics. On top of yesterday, Harry had to struggle to keep his temper in check and present the happy child appearance they all craved to see. The kids, of course, all knew Harry, but for most parents this was the first chance they had ever had to meet the famous boy. And they were making the most of the opportunity to say a few words to the little wizard. Not to mention to check out the 5-5. girls shadowing him and alternating holding his hands. Every parent's attention was drawn to the fact that Harry was here, enjoying a party with his wizard and witch friends, and not squirreled away in Equestria. Ginny and Hermione were quick to point out that Harry planned his birthday party for tomorrow at the Weasleys'. It was, however, restricted to just close friends. The parents understood that that party would be for Harry and Neville, to make up for the political nature of this one. His mum had convinced him that this would be the perfect semi-public manner in which to broadcast the message that Harry Potter was not available. It was the only thing that made the party bearable to Harry. His herdmates were more than happy to fulfill her request to be extra demonstrative, and Harry wasn't about to discourage them. Plus, parts of it were fun. The adults' fleeting disappointed looks whenever one or two of the girls hugged or kissed him, and he hugged and kissed back, showed that the strategy was working. Maybe it would keep some of the upper-year girls from making a nuisance of themselves, at their parents' requests. That wasn't the only goal, of course. This affair had been painstakingly orchestrated by the Equestrian princesses and Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, who was the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, and headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Every detail had been thoroughly planned ahead of time. It was all a demonstration to the wizards and witches that Harry was very involved with the United Kingdom's magical world. They didn't even want to hint that Harry considered Equestria his home and that he would be glad to be shot of the magical world once he left Hogwarts. That his mum, Princess Twilight, also attended the party, drew a great deal of the adults' attention, and there was a constant knot of wizards and witching around her, hanging on every word and asking questions about Equestria, or Atlantis, as they insisted on calling it. There was even a photographer at the party, allegedly to take photographs of the Longbottom heir enjoying his friends and the games they played at his party. The photographer, though, focused more on Harry and his mum than Neville. His equestrian girlfriends, Scootaloo, Sweetie Belle, and Apple Bloom, with their outrageous hair, by witchery standards, were always just outside the framed shots. On the other hoof, Ginny Weasley the pure BLD. Witch and Hermione Granger the Muggle-born new witch were almost always in the shot with Harry. If nothing else, the two girls were in the background interacting with another student, usually the son or daughter of the adult Harry was meeting. The party had almost every student from the first year, including Draco and his bunch. Fortunately, they were all on their best behavior. Their parents made sure of that. Still, Draco managed to let slip a few disgusted looks at the way the herd was fawning over Harry. He couldn't hide the envy in his eyes at seeing them easily swch back and forth from being ponies. He hadn't mastered the animagus transformation, himself, and wouldn't even be allowed to try until he had passed his OWLS. Naturally, none of the adults had had a chance, yet, to actually see the herd as their pony selves. As a result, the herd made a point of spending some of the party as ponies, to the non-students' delight. Harry had managed to talk his mum into inviting the Gryffindor Quidditch team, which served as a bit of a distraction. The parents watched, almost as gobsmacked as the students had been in Hogwarts on the first day, last year. Their calculating expressions, when they thought none of the herd were watching, made them shiver, and not pleasantly. Fortunately, as the party progressed, those calculating looks were mostly directed at Oliver Wood, the team captain, Alicia Spinnet and Angelina Johnson, the two chasers, who were all happy to show off their Pegasus forms, to the smaller ponies' relief. That Fred and George Weasley weren't shy to show off their unicorn forms also helped. Oliver even had the team members present put on a brief Pegasus Quidditch scramble for the crowd's entertainment. More than a few adults would be pressing their children to approach the gifted witches and wizards. Ron, while not as spectacular as a unicorn or Pegasus in his pony form, was happy to show off his growing skills on a vase of flowers. He, too, would find himself the target of a few admirers, Harry knew. From what his mum had told him, the non-herd members' animagus abilities made them into hot commodities. Daphne Greengrass seemed especially interested. Ron looked lost when surrounded by girls, and perpetually red-faced, sometimes almost matching his hair in shade. Harry's mum and the princesses had thought the adults might not get the message that the herd were a unit and couldn't be split up. They had planned accordingly. So it was that she casually let drop that the incoming class for this year at Hogwarts was going to have more than a few equestrian students. She didn't mention a number, but said it would be a dozen or two. She added, as an afterthought, that the princesses were planning on doing that for the foreseeable future. This new magic, and what the witches had done with it, was just so interesting. The adults that heard, quickly spread the news. Groups of adults quickly formed and the calculating look seemed friendlier, now, somehow. The fillies and girls were just as disgusted with the way the adults were acting as Harry and Neville. Of course, there wasn't anything they could actually do about it, though, except grin and bear it. Hermione managed to ignore it the best by disappearing into the Longbottom library for an hour before the herd noticed her absence, hunted her down, and dragged her out again. It was far worse than the grand galloping galas for all the attention Harry garnered, and at the expense of his friend. Harry had no doubt that if he had been older, he would have been in for a grand ball reception, just like the ones in Equestria. Fortunately, the witches and wizards seemed to think a birthday party would be more appropriate for the ages of the kids. If Neville had been in Equestria, he would have been at a grand ball for introduction to society. Here, that was put off for another 3 years. Neville didn't seem to mind not being in the limelight. In fact, he seemed quite relieved at not being the center of attention. During one quiet moment as they were setting up for the opening of the presents, Harry had to be sitting beside Neville for this. His mom had insisted the day before. Neville whispered, "I don't know how you do it. I'd be terrified of tripping or making a mistake." "You think I'm not?" Harry whispered back, looking at him with wide eyes. Neville gave him a look, then whispered, "Better you than me." Then he looked around and sighed. "Noblesse oblige." After the presents and cake, came more games. Eventually, Harry was relieved to see people started collecting their children and leaving. Naturally, every parent had to say their farewells to Harry as well as Neville. Which meant he and the girls were the last to leave. Before they left, however, Harry made a quick trip to one of the bathrooms. He just knew that a flu trip on a full bladder or even just a half-full one could only end in an embarrassing disaster for him. He was just washing his hands when someone else came in. He was tall, but otherwise rather nondescript. "Did you have a fun time?" he asked. Harry gave the standard, "It was great." The stranger nodded, and looked into the mirror as he twirled his long, thin, mustache. "Right," he said skeptically, and smirked. Harry glanced back into the mirror and froze. Standing beside him was Discord. He was afraid to look directly. Mirror Discord gave him a very wide grin. "Sometimes," he said in Pinkie Pie's voice, "subtlety can lead to far more entertainment than an outright prank." His grin grew wider. "Can you imagine a cuter couple than Diamond Tiara and Draco Malfoy?" Harry frantically tried to remember if he had seen that tall stranger talking to any of the adult wizards or witches at the party. As Harry stared at him in horror, he slowly dissolved into a white mist and disappeared. His mum was not pleased when he whispered his encounter to her. She told him to tell the Weasleys that something had come up and she had an important emergency meeting in Canterlot. He was exhausted by the time he made it back to the burrow. After dinner, they made their way outside. Ron took great pride in showing Apple Bloom what he had managed in the orchard so far that summer while the others took to the pond for swimming. After a late dinner, to compensate for all the cake and ice cream at the party, the girls retired to their trunk that had been magically expanded inside to an apartment while Harry bunked with Ron. It was an early bedtime. This year, for the first time, ever, Harry James Sparkle Potter had a birthday party on Earth, excepting that his parents had probably given him one when he was only a year old. Unfortunately, the Dark Lord Voldemort had killed them before his parents could give him a second birthday party. Unhappily, his remaining relatives had always said, "Freaks like you don't deserve birthday parties." So, he had only watched enviously as his cousin was outrageously fated to the excess on his birthday, and his cousin wasn't shy about demonstrating to Harry how much better he had it than the orphan. Which meant Harry's party in Equestria when he turned 10, 2 years ago, had been the first in his memory. It was too bad that he had been far too insecure at the time to enjoy the party. He had kept expecting that gotcha that the Dursleys had taught him to expect. He had been hesitant to accept a good occasion as anything but a trap to hurt him, whether physically or psychologically. Plus, everything about Equestria was still new to him. His second had been much more enjoyable, even if it had been overshadowed by his mum's disappointment over him concealing the existence of the portal to Earth. The letter from Hogwarts had also confused the occasion. This year, his birthday party in Equestria was a full-blown Pinkie Pie party celebration. It took place around lunchtime. Half the town, it seemed, had shown up, including every pony from the Ponyville primary school. Or, rather, every pony he had known before all the new ponies had moved into town. The portal, and its implications and realities, had swelled the population, doubling in the time he had spent at Hogwarts. The town was still quickly growing, becoming an important center for commerce, technology, and magic. Trains were no longer twice a day, but once an hour. The flu technology ameliorated that growth, somewhat. It allowed instant transportation across the entire continent of Equestria. Otherwise, the town would have been 10 times as big. However, the flu system, while growing by leaps and bounds, was still far too limited in scope to reach everywhere it was needed. As a result, many important ponies felt that their companies, educational facilities, or research firms required a physical presence, as well. Plus, flu powder was still in short supply and sharply rationed. At the party, the fillies and colts, and quite a few mares and stallions, were all agog at the rings the 5 fillies wore, although on this side of the portal they were bracelets. Harry's attempt to deflect attention from them with constant proclamations that the magical bracelets were to keep his filly friends safe merely enhanced the looks of all. Usually, it was the fillies getting gifts for their colts when things were serious. That they were magical, too, simply increased their importance as gifts. Harry, wisely, did not mention he had given other rings to his Gryffindor roommates and a few select other individuals at school. Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon were almost green with envy literally. He wondered if next year they both might show up at Hogwarts. He shuddered, remembering Discord's remark. Even being a year behind Harry and the CMC, the rewards of being versed in this new magic were just too great. Most of the older fillies were sad that Harry had a herd. On the other hoof, that he had removed so many fillies from the stallion competition was a pleasant thought to them. They were quite interested to hear that the ratio of mares to stallions on the other side of the portal was 1-to-1. He had to wonder, though, how many humans would be willing to move to Equestria and live as ponies. Or vice versa for the fillies and mares. He had to admit, he was perfectly willing to stay a pony or a person if his herd wanted. But the average person or pony? He couldn't see Malfoy, Zabini, Parkinson, or Greengrass being anything but disgusted at the idea. The same was true in reverse for Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon. Just from how his herd mates had reacted to the food and attitudes in the wizarding world, few ponies would be willing to abandon Equestria. But Discord. Although, now that he thought about it, the plenitude of magical gems in Equestria meant any such herds would have the financial ability to split their time between both worlds without too much strain. The Weasley children, with Arthur and Molly making a brief appearance, all attended the equestrian party. As did a few close friends from Hogwarts. The boys were more than a little bit overwhelmed by the attention they received from the fillies at the party. That the fillies and young mares here were so forward left them more than a bit skittish. Watching their reactions gave Harry quite a few laughs even as he realized he had reacted almost the same in his first year here. The girls from the Gryffindor Quidditch team were wide-eyed at the competition that lined up for the older boys on the team. Oliver was in second heaven for the attention he received from the Pegasi and spent almost the entire party discussing Quidditch, which was rapidly becoming a major topic among the Pegasi. Harry thought that if Wood wasn't careful, he might have a Quidditch team of herdmates. Everyone was interested in what he and the Cutie Mark Crusaders had been up to. His confirming the rumors of an entire herd of centaurs beside the school had every colt and filly shuddering, as well as a few adults. The Flower sisters fainted. His mum's assurances that the centaurs on the other side of the portal were friendly and eschewed the use of magic only partly calmed them down. Hopefully, the cutie mark crusaders, now that they had cutie marks, wouldn't cause too much destruction trying to see if they could get a witch a cutie mark when they returned to Hogwarts. Finally, having cutie marks had made for an oddly quiet end to the summer for the herd, and Ponyville. On the other hoof, long-time Ponyville residents still headed for cover when they saw them coming, to the bewilderment of the newest residents. Still, he had great fun at the party, as did every pony else. Of course, that depended on your definition of fun. Hermione spent most of the party interrogating the older unicorns on what interesting spells they might know. She was amazed to learn that most used magic on an instinctual level, and the unicorns actually knew fewer specific spells than she did. Meanwhile, the ponies spent most of their time interrogating Harry's herd and the visitors from Earth what they knew about magic. Seeing Pegasi and Earth ponies casting spells was, well, spellbinding. Next year's CRP of volunteers for Hogwarts might be quite a bit bigger. Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon were inordinately interested, Harry realized. Then it was back through the portal. It was time for more of the "let's show the witches and wizards that Harry Potter hasn't left England for Equestria" tour, Harry sourly thought. After the party in Equestria, Harry headed for the portal station. He would be staying with the Weasleys. Twilight and the Element Bearers had business in Canterlot, and so wouldn't be around to chaperone him at the house in Little Whinging. To his surprise, his herdmates went with him. He had thought it was only going to be him. It wouldn't be a problem, though. They still had their apartment trunks at both the Embassy and Weasley Orchard locations. He was sure the five would end up split between Ginny's improved room at the Burrow and the trunk left there. The private floonet connecting the apartment trunks made travel between them simple and easy. The party Mr. and Mrs. Weasley had put together for him when they arrived late that afternoon at the Weasley farmhouse was a nice change from the one the day before. The party included his friends from Hogwarts. Neville was much more relaxed than he had been at his own party. So was Harry. No surprises there. The Gryffindor Quidditch team, all the first ties from Gryffindor, plus a few from the other houses, including Ellie de Rippy, were in attendance. Ellie, Harry noted, seemed especially shy about being at the party. It was as if she had no idea what to expect at a party. Hadn't her family given her birthday parties? Even at his first birthday party in Equestria he sort of knew what to expect. He had, after all, had to listen to Dudley's parties while he was locked in his cupboard under the stairs. She acted like it was all foreign to her. How the Weasleys had convinced her to attend, he wasn't sure. He was glad they did, however. He still owed her for indirectly saving him last term. She still puzzled Harry. She had declined all his invitations to visit Equestria, saying she didn't want to impose. As wonderful as it sounded on the other side of the portal, she had written, he had invited a lot of people. She didn't want to distract him from his friends. Moreover, she had her family estate to learn to run, and most of her holiday time was taken with tutors and her aunt for that. Perhaps next summer, she suggested at the party when he again invited her. He was just glad she didn't expect to be another of his herdmates. Keeping the five he had happy would be hard enough. Still, she never strayed that far from Harry, or the fillies, while at the party. In fact, she seemed to spend more of her time around the equestrian fillies than Harry, Ginny, or Hermione. The party lasted until shortly after an early dinner, with swimming, a low-speed Quidditch, and several other games. A few of the finished prank candies from the twins were demonstrated, to great laughter. That a good time was had by all seemed to be the popular opinion as they left via the Fleur that evening. Ellie seemed both grateful to have been at the party, but oddly relieved, when she finally went home. Perhaps the party had been a bit too much. She seemed especially drowsy as she fled out. After 2 parties that day, one in Equestria and the other at the Weasleys, the younger kids were all exhausted and off to an early bed. Harry again bunked with Ron while the girls all retired to the trunk in Ginny's room. At loose ends until their letters for the coming year arrived, the 7 of them planned to spend the following weeks exploring Ottery St. Catchpole. Which, Harry had been told that morning, was in Devon, England. It had a small church, grocery, paper shop, garage, guest house, house and garden supply shop, school, and, of course, several pubs. The twins apparently quite liked the girl in the paper shop, joking easily with her. Besides the Weasleys, there were 3 other witching families in the village. There was the soon-to-be 5th year, Cedric Diggory and his parents, the soon-to-be 5th year, Sally Fawcett and her parents, and the soon-to-be 1st year Luna Lovegood and her father, Xenophilius. Xenophilius published the Quibbler, a news parchment. The Lovegoods, and their residents, were just as bizarre as the news parchment the family printed. The house resembled a giant chess piece, a rook. Mr. Lovegood himself dressed in robes almost as outrageous and eye-watering as those presented by Headmaster Dumbledore. His robes, though, seemed themed on chess pieces and mystery symbols. Luna appeared as odd as her father, and talked about creatures that no one else seemed to know anything about in a dreamy, not quite their voice. But she was a fun person to be around, Harry discovered. In mid-August, the 7 werewolf volunteers Remus had managed to convince went through the portal at 1-hour intervals starting at noon. All 7 collapsed and went into convulsions moments after crossing the portal, as expected. The waiting medical teams immediately rushed them to quarantine and made them as comfortable as possible. Remus, after checking with the hospital ponies and wizards, reported to the ministry, where he planned to spend the night in one of the Auror holding cells. He brought along a book and playing cards. The cards were in the hope he could convince the guards into playing a game of poker. He ended up losing about 10 galleons, but he considered it money well spent to have them so eagerly recount how they had taken the former werewolf's money in a card game during a full moon. As Remus had done the previous month, the werewolf volunteers convulsed as soon as Luna's moon crested the horizon. Then, after leaving the moon up for an hour, Luna retired it for the night. The moon had been up that long for Remus because it had taken them time to get the message to her about what was happening at the Portal Hospital. They might experiment with the exposure time at a later date, but they didn't want to take any chances this time. The next morning, when they checked, they discovered the process had worked. Transiting the portal as much as 8 hours before experiencing a full moonrise that night was a cure for the werewolf curse. The volunteers, all long-time veterans of the curse, were in tears of happiness at seeing the results of the werewolf curse testing spells. 2 of the women promised to have his children, if he wanted. The ponies wanted to be sure, and insisted that the former werewolves wait until the next day to return home to spread the good news. The ministry reluctantly gave Remus an official letter declaring that, because they had watched him all night on a full moon night and performed numerous magical checks, he was not a werewolf. For the normally destitute werewolves, Sirius was more than happy to set up a fund with the goblins to make sure no one was denied the opportunity. He even awarded the cured werewolves a 100 galleon present to help them get established. He included a party in Grimmauld Place to celebrate their new status. The party that night at Grimmauld Place almost took the walls down. No one under 18 was allowed in the doors. Headache cures were required by all the next morning. Several new couples emerged, as well. An overnight stay in a ministry holding cell, with periodic magical checks would be the procedure for all wizards and witches who wanted to prove they weren't werewolves. The director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement decided. If they didn't transform or show any other symptoms, they would receive a certification letter declaring them as having proved they weren't a werewolf. There would be a fee, of course. The ministry had to pay for the overtime for the Aurors, right? Only a few in the ministry objected to the situation. They were miserable die-hard conservatives who felt the werewolves should be eliminated instead of cured. Fortunately, pointing out to the minister that every cured werewolf meant additional income to the ministry in fees and taxes helped push through the certification process. For the first time, there was a complete cure available. It was painful, but no more so than the transformation itself, all the subjects had reported. Word of that had raced through the hidden community of werewolves. Many still didn't believe it, but many more were willing to try. The Portal Hospital ended up booked up for the next several months on the nights of the full moon. Rather than just one night, as it was on Earth, Luna had consented to making a full moon rise on 3 consecutive nights. That way the newly cured could see for themselves it had worked for them before they went home. It also gave the hospital an additional day to process patients. Many of the cured opted to remain in Equestria for a time. To Harry's amusement, all of the cured werewolves now had a unicorn as their animagus form. They had gone from pure predator to very dangerous prey. Such irony. It was a quiet night or very early morning, take your pick at the Ponyville Sweet Apple Acres portal station. The unicorn sergeant looked up from her paperwork as the three changelings walked into the check-in office. The station, at the edge of the ever-free forest, rarely received any visitors, official or otherwise, this late at night. The last time had been a full-blown princess-declared emergency, and hundreds of guard ponies had trooped through at near gallops with a truly impressive array of new equipment, some not out of the experimental stage. She raised an eyebrow inquisitively at them as she almost unobtrusively slid a report, the latest update about traffic through the portal, over her copy of Playfilly. Preoccupied at the sudden appearance of visitors, and hiding her magazine, she didn't notice the almost invisible flash from the stolen wand as it cast a slight confundus on the sergeant. Of course, that it came from under one of the three unicorns instead of one of their horns, as a pony would normally expect, helped to hide it. In any event, she would now be inclined believe whatever they said to her. After staring at them dully for a moment, she blinked once and asked, "What can I do for you?" as she pressed the button on the floor for assistance. The lead unicorn, a light green with a light blue mane and tail, lifted a paper out of her saddlebags and sent it to the sergeant. It was a short note, just a request that the doctor's pony, Bones, and Ball travel through the portal to the little whinging embassy as soon as possible. The soldier frowned as she glanced at the clock. It was nearly 1:47 to be exact. Both the portal and the embassy were usually almost deserted at this time, although attendants were always present at the entrances to both. The door to the left of the three ponies opened and a unicorn guard came through. He stepped to the side to watch the three visitors, keeping the sergeant out of his line of fire, as he closed the door. He wore one of the new saddle-mounted rifle systems with barrels on both sides and automatic ammunition feeds. A spark shot from his horn to the sergeant, who didn't even look at the newcomer as she sent a spark back. "The letter arrived while I was having dinner," said the light green unicorn. "I gathered Doctor's Ball," she nodded at the amber stallion, with a dark blue mane and crossed bones as a cutie mark, and Pony, a pale blue unicorn with two-tone red mane, and came here as fast as we could. Even with that new fleur travel, it took a bit of time, she finished. Hidden by the other two unicorns, the wand underneath the stallion flashed a second time, and the second unicorn was hit with a confundus. The sergeant sighed and pursed her lips. Without warning, a spark shot from her horn to each of the three ponies. They had expected that the spark was a spell to reveal a disguised changeling. Even though they knew the spell would pass them, they couldn't stop their reflexive stiffening. The guard pony smiled ruefully at their reactions. "Sorry about that, but it's what we have to do now." Dr. Bones nodded genially. "Yes, we know. We get those every day. Still a surprise, though. I imagine it will be a few more years before that becomes an ignored feature of conversation for unicorns." "I assure you," the stallion said, firmly, lifting his muzzle arrogantly, "that we are not illusioned either. So, you don't need to do that." The sergeant blinked at the unusual declaration, paused, and nodded sagely. The unicorn with saddle-mounted rifles blinked, frowned bemusedly, then returned to his attentive stare. 3 sheets flew out of a basket on Sergeant's desk, and she quickly noted their names, descriptions, and cutie marks on them. Dr. Bones' cutie mark was 2 crossed bones. Thigh bones from the look. From the sergeant's expression, Dr. Ball, cutie mark clearly left him mystified. How did a trio of a foal's multicolored ball lead to becoming a doctor? Dr. Pony's cutie mark was scary, a patchwork pony doll with a scalpel over it. She kept looking from it to the doctor's face. The 3 could see her trying to figure out how a filly got that as a cutie mark. And if she should be worried about it. After she finished writing, she took pictures of the cutie marks. She attached the Polaroids to the papers while grinning at the 3 doctors. "Gotta love those new cameras from Earth. Instant pictures without magic," she declared, and shook her head wonderingly. She lifted 3 green badges from a drawer, carefully wrote their names on the badges, attached them to lanyards, and held them out in her magic to the 3 doctors. They each put on their lanyard. Then she stared at their letter a moment. Without a sound, a copy appeared, which she then clipped to the pictures and the other documents. She dropped them all into a basket on her desk. The stallion stifled his longing to sigh in relief. It had taken them 3 months to acquire the right paper, discover the right letterhead, the right seal, and the proper written mannerisms of the purported sender. Their forgery had passed the first, and most important, inspection. "We have to check for contraband," the sergeant explained as she floated the letter back to Dr. Pony. "Please step into the next room." The unicorn standing beside the open door to the interior of the building, smiled pleasantly as the 2 Mares and Stallion walked into the next room. He closed the door behind them, leaving the sergeant alone, once more, on a dull night. Inside the room were 2 more ponies, a Pegasus and an Earth pony. They also were wearing rifle saddles. The Earth pony stood in front of the closed exit from the room where he had all 3 unicorns in clear sight. The Pegasus hovered near the ceiling beside the entrance and above the end of the long table that divided the room. The door behind the table was closed. The 3 guards were positioned so that none were in the other's line of fire. "Please place your saddlebags on the table and empty them," the unicorn said as he walked behind the counter, closing the hinged counter door. The changelings had expected this. It was still more than a bit terrifying, knowing that they had little to no way of escaping if things went wrong. The doctors were quick to respond. All 3 had a tied bundle of instruments specific to their profession. As professionals, they were expected to carry such, as well as a few appropriate medicines and bandages in their bags. Dr. Bones even had a small bottle of the new Skillgrow. In addition, they each had a bag of about 100 bits and several gemstones varying from tiny to hoof size. There were no clothes, of course. Nothing they owned would fit on the other side of the portal. The guard behind the table sighed. "I'm sorry," he said regretfully, "but we can't let you take bits or loose gems with you through the portal. We will credit your bits to the embassy. You may withdraw their equivalent value, as you need, in the local currency. The gems will be kept in a safe deposit box until you return." He noted their names from the lanyards and wrote them on 6 small boxes he pulled from below the counter. For each doctor, the gems went into one box and the coins into the other. He cast a targeted finite spell inside the bags, then felt around inside each to make sure it was empty, and that there were no hidden undetectable expansion or don't notice this charms in use. Dr. Ball hid his smile. They had known this was the procedure. By providing the ponies with obvious contraband, the ponies wouldn't expect any more. Not wearing clothes also made it obvious they weren't trying to hide gems. The normal body scan for contraband wouldn't detect the gems they had taped inside the holes in their legs, as, technically, they weren't inside their bodies. That was the problem with tailored spells, they were rather restricted in what they could do. It took only a few more minutes before the 3 illusion-hidden changelings trotted out of the portal entrance building and down the path that led to the portal. "I can't believe that." "Actually worked," said 56 Emmy, formerly known as Worker Infiltrator Cadet 370-456 via their mind link. "Why wouldn't it have," said Earl, the one posing as the unicorn stallion, "you 2 worked hard enough for it." Unlike the other 2, he was a male, a drone. His designation was Drone URL 370-456. "And I practiced that spell until I was dreaming of it." "Yeah, we know, we saw the dreams," Emmy said dryly. At the creche in the hive, the entire group had been honored to be one of the few with a drone in their creche. That he, and the other permanent hive inhabitants, had accompanied the infiltrators and soldiers in the attack had been astonishing, to say the least. Queen Mother had committed the entire Ling population into the assault. There would be no returning to the hive. No Ling had been left in the hive, and the reservoirs of food had been emptied. The entire invasion was a do-or-die effort. Failure meant the likely extinction of the hive. The rumor mill, whispered from Ling to Ling instead of in the mind link, was that the hive was in crisis. The reservoirs were draining at a rate much faster than the infiltrators could replenish. A rate that had accelerated as the hive had grown larger in the years building up to the invasion. Soon, they would run out of food and they were already on limited rations for non-essential lings. That was probably the reason why Creche 370,456 had been the last set of eggs laid. There would have been no ling left behind to take care of the eggs or nymphs. Usually, as one creche reached cadet age, the next set of eggs were laid and incubated. This time, however, there hadn't been any eggs laid even when the cadets reached the end of their hive training and were ready for field training. As a result, their creche hadn't been large enough to replace the lings lost through accidents, age, and protecting the hive over the last few years. Unfortunately, for 56 SE Worker Infiltrator Cadet 370, for 56 SE and 56 ME, drones like Earl were well useless outside the hive, as he well knew. He wasn't even as mature, physically or mentally, as the workers despite being the same age, and he knew it. It would be several more years before he would be old enough to be presented to the Queen as an adult, for her to trade to another hive. He hadn't been trained for the warrior class, infiltrator class, harvester class, gatherer class, or any class, really. Why waste training resources on a ling that was just going to be given in trade to another hive, anyway? He had had access to the hive mind, of course, but little to no reason to internalize any of it. Not to mention that there is a big difference between knowing something and being able to do it. Without training or regular use, knowledge is useless. He was, by the infiltrator's standards, simple and a bit slow. And yet, he was the one who had come up with this idea when they realized their original plan was fatally flawed. They had wanted to protect Earl until he reached maturity. Once he was an adult, they would have taken him to one of the other hives and offered to trade him to them in exchange for the other two to join the hive. If he were a mature drone, alone, the new hive would have eagerly accepted him at what amounted to no cost for them. The problem was with ME and SE. Usually, workers were never traded between hives. Captured workers, if they hadn't fought to the death, were quickly worked to that state. With any luck, offering Earl would get them accepted as his personal slaves at the least, if the new hive wouldn't accept them as second-tier workers. They wouldn't have good jobs, but they would be alive. Which they all agreed was a better fate than trying to live by themselves without a hive behind them. Starvation and predation were very possible outcomes, otherwise. Earl was happy to agree to this, as the two infiltrators had the skills to keep him alive for the years it would take for him to reach that level. Skills he didn't have, and only vaguely understood. Unfortunately, during the year and a half that they had wandered the fringes of Equestria, they had discovered that using him to negotiate a place in a new hive wouldn't work. Queen Mother's attempt to conquer Canterlot, and Equestria, had not only failed, but had revealed the existence of changelings to the unsuspecting ponies. The drones and workers from their hive, they discovered, were considered contaminated with a defective decision-making process. How could a new hive have faith that any of the decisions made by former members of the chrysalis hive were well-reasoned? As a result, the other hives had decided that any benefits a drone might bring were offset by being from a defective hive. There was the distinct possibility that their own decision-making might be contaminated, if they accepted the drone. Not to mention their reluctance to add to their hive's population. The newly alerted ponies made gathering food much more difficult. In fact, the hives would have to go on short rations to weather the temporary difficulties of too many lings while they reduced their populations over the next few decades. Sneaking past the new ling detection spell was impossible. It worked by first detecting the active use of the disguise magic, then it forced them back to their normal form. Worse, the ponies had quickly deployed that spell everywhere. They had even started putting the spell on entrances to buildings, so even if there weren't any unicorns around, say in an earth pony farming village, a ling could still be caught. They had despaired surviving. Then, one night, Earl had said, if it detects the disguise magic, then don't use that. Use an illusion. To the other two's amazement, their trial had worked. But that came with its own drawbacks. They had to avoid touch at all costs. With the ponies wanting to hug at a moment's notice, it became quite a chore to acquire the love they needed, but not impossible. But at least they could travel in safety among the ponies. Still, that was not a permanent solution. Someday, somewhere, they would be found out. Until then, though, they could haunt the parks, fairs, nightclubs, and other locations where ponies tended to crowd, and survive by remaining on the outskirts. Now, at least, they had a chance to come up with another solution. It was at a fool's party that they had heard the rumor of a portal to another world. Months passed as they reconnoitered the situation, leading them to this desperate bid at escape. If the numbers they had heard were accurate, they could safely disappear into a new world where none suspected their presence. A bit of careful shadowing of the few humans that made the trip to Ponyville had shown that there was a possibility of finding enough emotional food to survive. "We're not through yet, so pay attention," ordered Essie. While they were walking up the path, they were surreptitiously transferring the gems hidden in their leg holes into their saddlebags. They didn't want to take a chance that going through the portal with those still in their legs might cause severe problems on the other side. They shouldn't, but who knew for sure? The illusions on themselves, and the gems, helped mask what they were doing from the ponies they knew were watching them. The second checkpoint was a bit easier to navigate. They were subjected, again, to the Ling detection spell. The third checkpoint was just as simple, and then they were trotting around the tree portal on the spiral path. They took off their saddlebags and slipped on the simple robes at the portal itself. Then, it was on to a new world and surviving in their new, bipedal forms. The unicorn on duty on the other side had been warned to expect 3 doctors. When 3 very short people walked out of the portal, he was a little startled. They had planned for this. They hadn't known what they would look like on going through. Ponies became humans, but what happened with changelings? They practiced for weeks being minotaurs, trolls, and gargoyles to familiarize themselves with different forms of bipedal locomotion. The body shapes were different, and each exerted its own influence on movement. They hoped that such practice wouldn't leave them slow and clumsy when whatever they became, they became. The unicorn immediately started to use his magic to help the 3 that had just come through stay upright. "Please remain calm, I'll help you stand up." All 3 were play-acting at being clumsier than they really were. They had told the portal minders on the other side that they had been practicing bipedalism. They knew that that information would have been passed on to the minders on this side. The unicorn was distracted and annoyed that they appeared to have lied about practicing walking. That their forms were also unexpectedly small, merely added to his confusion. Partially hidden by his sisters, Earl grabbed his wand from where it was stuck on his stomach. The moment he had it in hand, he cast a confundus at the unicorn, and took a quick look around. They were lucky, there weren't any other ponies in sight. "Thank you for your help," Earl said loudly, casting an illusion on himself, as did the other 2, that he was an adult. There had been plenty of pictures on the equestrian side of what humans looked like for him to cast something accurate. He used an illusion as they were unsure if the ponies on this side of the portal would use the Ling spell, and ruin their escape. "As you can see, we're fine," he continued firmly. "Everything is the way it should be." They were no longer pretending clumsiness. Slightly awkward, yes. Clumsy? No. "We can handle the dressing rooms by ourselves, no need to worry yourself about us." The unicorn nodded absent-mindedly, his magic stopping. The Lings quickly ducked into their respective dressing rooms on either side of the central hall. Fortunately, both rooms had several large posters demonstrating proper apparel for their respective sexes. Apparel which was stocked in the dressing rooms. The posters changed with the seasons, obviously. In short order, the 3 exited the rooms. They nodded to the unicorn guard, who nodded back and smiled, then made a note on the paper on his desk. They made their way past him to the next, main room, where another unicorn gave them a look over before nodding approvingly. He hit them with the Ling spell, of course, and asked to see their lanyards. He verified what they had said on the other side, examined their letter, then waved them onward. The walk to the dome exit, and the walk to the embassy were much shorter than in Equestria. They did notice the heavily armed guards watching them closely. They were hit with the Ling spell twice more before they entered the embassy itself. Exiting the embassy was easy. Once they passed the guard portal side entrance at the back, they headed for main entrance in the front. On one side of the door was a large map of Little Whinging, on the other was a map of London. They studied both carefully, taking their time. This close to the door, they could feel the presence of a Ling spell. Apparently, the doors were both the first and last defense of the embassy, depending on which way you were going. Then they merely went straight out the front doors. No fuss, no bother. Everyone assumed they knew what they were doing. The door's Ling detection spell disturbed them no more than any of the others they had experienced. They didn't even slow down. They had made it. They luxuriated in the feeling for a moment, then started down the street. They would find a dark alley and transform to birds. That would let them cover far more distance than any pony would expect. Now, to see if they could survive on what love the humans provided and if the magicals could supply more than the non-magicals. Fortunately, they had enough reserves for several weeks, at least. Administrator David Williams and Director General Arthur Pryor, of the British National Space Centre, BNSC, were both hopeful and dreading their meeting with the Prime Minister. The sudden appearance the previous summer of the Equestrians, intelligent aliens from another world, had shaken their agency to the core. Proof positive that life existed elsewhere in the universe. That they appeared as normal people, albeit with unusual hair colors, threw everyone into a tizzy, at first. The religious authorities were at a loss as to how to proceed. Some viewed the aliens as an affront their God had made humans the top of the heap, how dare these interlopers show up? Some Christians and Muslims viewed them as demons out to tempt humans from God's true salvation. Others saw an opportunity to proselytize and save the souls of the aliens. Many saw their human-like appearance as proof that the human form was the epitome of perfection as designed by their God. There was a rumor that the aliens had their own gods, which, as scientists, the two men knew was to be expected. What was not expected was that the aliens claimed they could meet with and discuss things with their gods. Confusingly, they also said that their gods didn't want to be called gods, or worshipped, and could get quite pissy about it if crossed on the matter. Then it was discovered that they had the ability to become miniature horses, ponies, they styled themselves. That was their normal form had cheesed off the fanatics. How dare they abandon the perfect human form designed by the human god. Obviously, they were mere farm animals and should be subjugated as such. Adding salt to the wound for those religious extremists was that the ponies had 3 tribes: normal, winged, and horned, and were so cute that prolonged exposure had to lead to diabetes. Their technology quite clearly proved they were anything but farm animals. That these aliens had used a portal to directly arrive had been a shock, as had been the revelations of their technology. That something without hands could produce railroads, tall buildings, and airships had been stunning, and thrown out all the theories about how intelligence developed and that you had to have hands to do it. That they were a prey species with bright colors that would easily attract the attention of predators was just plain confusing. According to most evolutionary theories, prey animals should be dull-colored and capable of hiding in plain sight. These aliens had colors that almost should be visible from space, for God's sake. There were those who insisted the aliens were here to enslave mankind. Those proponents claimed that the aliens' peaceful attitude was a sham to fool humans. When they had sufficient forces on hand, they would take over the world. That the aliens only seemed interested in Britain's deep culture and were freely sharing life-saving techniques such as a cure for cancer were merely facades in front of their ruthless drive to conquer Earth, according to those detractors. Which brought them to today's meeting. Was the entire BNSC a waste of time, effort, and money? Why bother with rockets when you can simply step through a door? Were they about to be informed of the dissolution of their agency? Or, was this a meeting that would set off a new age of space exploration? After all, only a few months ago, incredible devices began to appear from 5 of the 11 partners in their consortium. The Department for Business, Innovation and Skills unveiled a machine that could scan for and cure cancer, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, with the Technology Strategy Board and the Natural Environment Research Council, had produced air scrubbers for both heavy industry and road vehicles, reducing air pollution by over 50%, so far, and seemed headed for zero. Rumors abounded about other devices in development to recover raw materials from waste and rubbish tips, both reducing waste and decreasing the need for imported material. The dead silence from the military indicated that they had a few new toys, too, or they would have been front and center demanding access to the technology these aliens had developed. There was a rumor that they even had a portal-like system for instant transport between two locations hundreds or thousands of kilometers apart. When the other participants began to show up, the two's confusion increased. They silently watched as Sir Patrick Walker, Director General of Military Intelligence 5, and Sir Colin McCall, Director General of Military Intelligence 6 came in, with their secretaries. Next through the door were the Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Douglas Hurd, and the Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Kenneth Wilfred Baker, with their secretaries. With them was a military officer, a major. Last, of course, was the Prime Minister, John Major, with his secretary. He looked a bit harried, which was probably only natural with the upheaval the aliens had thrown at the government and their society. John looked around as he sat down. "Good, everyone's here." He nodded and glanced at the two BNSC officials. "It has been brought to my attention that Britain has an unparalleled opportunity to jump to the forefront in the world's efforts to explore space." The two officials exchanged quick looks. They weren't sure if this would be good news or not. As well as keep an eye on our enemies. David and Arthur maintained attitudes of polite interest. "As you know," the Prime Minister continued, "the Equestrians have been generous with their technology." He sighed, "I'm sure you're both familiar with Doctor Who and his, 'it's bigger on the inside' TARDIS." They both frowned and gave hesitant nods. "The Equestrians have developed that technology." They gave him incredulous looks. The others in the room were all nodding. "Another technology they have developed is a method to reduce the apparent weight mass of an object." Arthur leaned back in his chair with his eyebrows raised while David gave the Prime Minister a bug-eyed stare. "Major Thomas, if you'd show them the demonstration modules." The military officer nodded and picked up his briefcase to set on the table. "The Major is part of our new Special Technology Division in the Army," the Prime Minister explained, "who are attempting to learn and integrate the equestrian technology to what we know and have." The Major opened his briefcase, then reached in far deeper than should have been possible, all the way to elbow in a case that couldn't have been more than a hand's length deep, and that would have been with the case closed. Both BNSC officials stood and leaned forward to look into the briefcase, astounded. They could see that it was deeper than the table. Grinning at their gobsmacked expressions, the man lifted one side of the briefcase with his other hand so they could see underneath the entire bottom of the case. There wasn't a hole in the table, nor could they see his other arm, still buried in the briefcase. He set the briefcase back, flat, on the table. Thomas lifted up a steel box and set it on the table, then lightly pushed it with one finger across to the two men. "Pick it up," he said, smirking. Mystified, Arthur picked up the box. It was about the size of a book, 3 or 4 fingers thick. It was much lighter than it appeared, so much so that he began to doubt it was steel, and that it had to be empty. There was a small latch on one side and a hinge on the opposite side. He handed it to David and looked back at the Major, and the others, puzzled. David handed it back to Thomas after inspecting it. Still grinning, the military man walked around the table to stand beside the two. He set the box on the table, opened it, twisted a dial, then closed it. "Now try to pick up," he said with a bit of a challenge. Shrugging, Arthur casually went to lift the box, but it didn't budge to his loose grip. He tried lifting one edge to get a better grip and found it took a surprising amount of effort. It easily weighed 4 or 5 pounds. He put it back on the table with a thud that made David look at him with surprise. He could only stare, glancing between the inexplicably heavy box and the others in the room, all of whom were hiding smile or not. Thomas reached into his briefcase and started taking out a pole that was longer than any of the dimensions of the briefcase it came out of. Ginning, he handed one end to Arthur. From its weight, Arthur guessed it was aluminium. Holding the other end, Thomas must have done something because the pole suddenly, and drastically, increased its weight, pulling itself out of his hand. His end crashed to floor with a heavy thud. "Please be seated," the Prime Minister prompted, knocking them both out of their daze. "Can you imagine what we could do with an entire launch vehicle's worth of propellant in a tin that weighed less than your briefcase?" he said. The two just sat there, stunned. John's secretary opened her briefcase, took out 2 folders, walked around their positions, and placed them in front of the 2 men. "We've kicked around a few ideas," the Home Secretary said. "We considered the idea of building something ourselves, but it would take years and take us some 10 times your budget, at the minimum." Kenneth gave the Foreign Secretary a sidelong look. "However, Douglas suggested we buy the Russian Buran space plane. Colin," he glanced at the director of MI6, "tells us that the Russian space program is pretty much dead in the water. Depending on who you talk to, it is either still in progress, or cancelled. In either case, all future flights have been cancelled and funds are rapidly drying up. He says that for the right amount, the Ruskies will be happy to unload their space plane and recoup some of their investment." Douglas, the Foreign Secretary, said, "I believe that if we were to offer them £50 million, plus £500,000 to rent the Antonov Maria to get it here, they might settle for 70 or 80 million. With a bit of de-airing, we might be able to get the Buran and the Tichka for 100. The Tichka isn't complete, though." He grinned at his colleague. "Still, a steal, since it's estimated to have cost them close to 4 billion rubles for each plane, with inflation currently at a 75-to-1 and the ruble falling fast." Arthur looked at the Prime Minister. "And the launch vehicle? The Energia?" he asked, mouth dry. "No need. From what my experts tell me, we can take off from ground. But we don't have room in our budget for such expenditures," David tentatively ventured. "The funds will come from some of the earnings produced by the medical devices we've developed and started selling. The Yanks, alone, have put in orders for over 1,000 of the machines. They've ordered double that of the industrial pollution scrubbers. Plus, there are other devices in development," Kenneth put in. In the room, only the Major, the Administrator, and the Director didn't know that the government had traded 100 tons of aluminium to Equestria in exchange for 100 tons of gold, nearly 500 million sterling pounds. The Prime Minister had a rather large slush fund to back any Equestrian proposals on this side of the portal. Or projects he deemed necessary for the needs of the United Kingdom without raising taxes. Major Thomas has been assigned to the BNSC to facilitate the integration of this new technology. One of the first tests will be the effectiveness of this technology with a decommissioned Bristol bloodhound. There was silence for several seconds as the two officials looked at each other and the Prime Minister. "Right, then," John said, placing his hands on the table and standing. "That's sorted." He looked down at the two. "I expect weekly reports." He nodded to them, then swept out of the room followed by everyone except Major Thomas. "I think I need to have a bit of a lie down," Arthur said. "You might be right," said David, faintly. Thomas grinned and pulled a bottle of something amber out of his briefcase, with 3 glasses. He poured the glasses and handed them to the 2 stunned officials. "Gentlemen," he said bracingly, "you're about to become a part of history as presiding over Britain's first space plane, and possibly putting Britain's first astronauts on the moon, then Mars, then the stars." They stared at him, wide-eyed, then downed their glasses. Friday, April 24, 8:45 p.m. Williams, Pryor, and Thomas slowly walked around the modified Bristol Bloodhound Mark II missile and its mount. The technicians were giving it one final check-over before launch in just 15 minutes. They were at the Audubon Army Training Estate, Britain's largest live-fire military training estate. It was in northern England, about 11 hours from London by car, and covered 60,000 acres, 242 square kilometers of vacant land. No worries about hitting anything important should things go pear-shaped. Thomas was impressed at the speed with which the BNSC had acquired the decommissioned system and modified it. The ramjets that powered the anti-aircraft missile in flight had been discarded. The ramjet's fuel tanks in the core missile had been replaced with kerosene and liquid oxygen thrusters, and its fuel tanks. It could operate without a problem in the airless environment it would soon occupy. The Major had been the one to install a special technology, fuel tanks that allowed the missile to carry far more fuel than should have been possible. He had actually just brought in a shortened, newly painted tanks from another bloodhound, supplied by his superiors, of course. It was shorter to make room for the new engine placement. The non-magical technicians had then installed it. After the pressure test for leaks, he had cast a Don't Notice This spell later that night, then cast the expansion spell on the inside of the new tank. It wasn't permanent a week, at most they only needed the expanded capacity to last until an hour after launch when the tank would again be empty. Fueling the missile earlier in the day had required his constant vigilance in preventing the other technicians from noticing that they were putting in far more than would normally fit in the space occupied by the tanks. The confundus was both a blessing and a curse. While it made it easy to get the technicians doing the fueling from noticing that the kerosene and LOX trucks were far too large, it also meant the technicians weren't paying as much attention to their jobs as needed when handling dangerous, explosive materials. The other two were giving the missile and its launch rig a more critical eye. BNSC was using the original mount, no need, really, to change that. It made things much simpler. For the mount, the missile weighed just the right amount for a fully fueled missile, another detail from the Major. They moved over to the launch control vehicle. The head technician looked up. Everything is green. We couldn't ask for better weather conditions, and the airspace is clear. David and Arthur just nodded. The launch schedule wouldn't be changed unless something went wrong. So far, nothing had. The 4 solid propellant boosters were unchanged from the original. They would fire for only 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds they would push the missile to Mach 2.5, or 857 meters per second. It was an acceleration that would pulp a human, nearly 29 times the Earth's gravity. The launch was spectacular. One moment the missile was on its mount, the next it wasn't. Even knowing where to look, Thomas lost sight of the missile almost instantly. 1.2 kilometers downrange, 3/4 of a kilometer altitude, climbing at 88 degrees. Boosters off. Main engine in nominal range. Boosters have dropped, a flight technician said. Everything is green. Thomas knew the missile would now proceed at a more sedate acceleration of 87 meters per second, or 8.8 gravities. The guidance system would make sure the missile maintained that near-vertical attitude until the engines shut down for good. Compared to the Earth's orbital plane around the Sun, the missile was spot-on at perpendicular. That reduced the odds that they might hit anything while the plane the planets orbited in was filled with comets, asteroids, pebbles, dust, and other junk. Vertically had a substantial reduction of such objects. It also dramatically reduced the odds of interacting with any of the junk put in orbit in the last 50 years. The space might technically be nearly empty, but that nearly was still very crowded compared to the space between planets. As expected, the modified Bloodhound outran their on-site radar installation and they switched to a feed from the UK air surveillance and control system in Fylingdales a few seconds later. Then came the steady chant of altitude readings as the missile climbed. 10 kilometers, 20, 30, 50, 70, 100. Time mark, coming on 60 seconds mark. Altitude, 157 kilometers. Velocity, 5.2 kilometers per second. Course within 1% of projected. Soon, Thomas knew, the missile would outrun their radar capabilities. Fylingdales, after all, was oriented more towards watching known launches of hostile aircraft and missiles from over the horizon, not staring straight up into space. Switching to Spacecom for continued tracking established. It was an unfortunate fact that launching any missile that went high enough might be construed as a military ballistic launch strike. As such they had to notify the Yanks, Russians, and Chinese didn't want any misunderstanding, right? Britain had never launched a potential ballistic missile from the island. As a result, he knew that all three would be closely watching this launch, the Yanks, especially. BNSC had had to confide in them that they were testing some new technology and needed assistance in tracking it. Hence, the standby feed from America once the missile cleared their horizon. "All systems green, engine nominal," called out one of the technicians. "Coming on 2-minute mark. Altitude 626 kilometers. Velocity, 10.4 kilometers per second. Course on track." The Yanks shuttle lost its solid fuel. Boosters at 2 minutes, approximately, but they only carried the shuttle to 45 kilometers. There would be some intense interest from them, the Russians, and the Chinese on seeing this performance. At 9 minutes after launch, Thomas's cell phone vibrated twice, then stopped. His wide grin at the success, so far, of the rocket launch grew a bit wider. While the other scientists considered this merely a proof-of-concept test, Thomas knew the results could dramatically change the scope of the BNSC plans for a spaceplane, and the program they would build on top of this test. How far did magic extend in space? Would the spells fail in Earth-low orbit? How about middle? Or high orbit? Was geostationary the limit? What about farther away from the planet, like the moon? The scientists were very unhappy at being unable to put any experiments on board. There hadn't been sufficient time to create any. There were two, however, Thomas knew, in what used to be the warhead. They shared that space with the radio transmitter that would help the scientists track how far the missile actually traveled. The scientists weren't allowed to know that, though. The "Don't Notice This" spell had prevented any questions during installation and any subsequent inspections. The first magical experiment had 6 components. It would test how far a port key could reach. They knew the minimum had to be 12,756 kilometers, the Earth's diameter at the equator, its widest distance, because wizards had used port keys to cross from one side of the world to the other. But those were always based on being close to the ground. What about much higher? Or even beyond that? The experiment used a mechanical timer and 6 port keys. The first port key, triggered by a plunger at 9 minutes after launch, would be at an altitude of about 13,000 kilometers, to verify the minimum distance a port key would work in space, and if it would work that far away from the ground. That was what the phone call was about. Receiving it notified him that the first port key had, indeed, arrived at its destination back on Earth. That confirmed that port keys could be used to transfer back and forth between the Earth and a spaceship or station in medium orbit. Coming up on 10 minutes an engine shutdown, on mark. A second technician announced, engine had shut down. Altitude verified as 15,000 kilometers, velocity according to Doppler is 52 kilometers per second. The engine had exhausted the 12 tons of fuel in its expanded fuel tank, and was now ballistic. There would be no problems when that spell failed sometime tomorrow. This was when the second experiment came into play. It was more important than the first. There was a bomb on board that was held from exploding by a small spell. Should the ambient magic fall to the point where it couldn't maintain the spell boom, the abrupt cessation of the radio transmission would give them an exact distance to that failure, which would put a real damper on deep space exploration. That it hadn't failed, yet, meant there was hope. David went to his car and pulled out a big bottle of champagne and a basket with a dozen glasses. As far as the scientists knew, the launch was a complete success and they could go home after a suitable celebration, of course. The celebration would be brief for David, Arthur, and Thomas, then they would return to their headquarters via helicopter. Thomas knew from their calculations that in 2 hours, while they were still in transport, the coasting missile would pass the moon's orbit. That would activate the third port key set for the moon's orbit. Before that, though, the second port key would initiate at 1 hour and 4 minutes, a distance of 200,000 kilometers halfway to the moon. That would clear all near-Earth space for the use of magic. 12 days later, it would pass Mars' orbit relative to Earth, the distance at which Mars is closest to Earth, and trigger the fourth port key. The fifth would activate in 90 days, at a distance of 402 million kilometers, the maximum range between Earth and Mars. That would open up all of the inner solar system to easy and cheap exploration. 5 months and 23 days after liftoff it would pass Jupiter's orbit and the final port key would activate. The entire asteroid belt would be open to safe exploration. Jupiter, itself, would be within port key reach for almost 6 months at a time. The port keys would also provide important data, as the port key devices used mechanical gauges to measure both pressure and temperature. Making everyone wear a spacesuit might be aggravating, but it would be better than having the first passenger arrive at their destination frozen solid because no one had checked for that danger. The included stopwatches would also give them an exact measure on how long port key travel took. Thomas was very interested in seeing how long a port key to Mars would take. Port keys would make mining the asteroids a simple 9-to-5 job. Resource limitations would become a thing of the past. He was not disappointed to receive 2 more calls on his phone that he didn't need to answer on his way home. Thursday, April 30th, 9:08 a.m. Yuri Koptev, the new director for the Russian Space Agency, stared at the British ambassador, Sir Roderick Braithwaite, almost speechless. "You are making a joke." "Yes," he said, raising his eyebrows in consternation. Roderick shook his head and smiled genially. "Not at all, Director Koptev, my government wishes to buy your Storm shuttle for £50 million. At the current exchange rate, that would be about 4 billion rubles. Which, if our information is correct, is the approximate cost of the space plane." Both were speaking fluent Russian. "No," Yuri said, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, but no." Roderick sighed dramatically. "Director Koptev, for the last 3 years the Storm space plane has been drastically underfunded. The second flight was supposed to take place in 1989, but was scratched to provide funding for other satellites. The second ship, Little Bird, despite being delivered in 1989, is still sitting in its hangar only 90% complete." He leaned forward. "The likelihood that the Kremlin will release sufficient funds to launch the Storm are nearly zero. As director, you must know that. You might get the funds for finishing Little Bird, but that money would be better spent building and launching a weather satellite or for unmanned scientific exploration. Which is where I would expect such funds to go, regardless of them being released for the shuttle. Plus, the Storm is just not cost-effective to use as a truck to the Mir space station. The Proton rocket is a cheaper alternative, giving you 3 trips for the cost of the one it would take for the Storm." He shook his head sadly, just thinking about it, and leaned back in his chair. "Based on the political climate of the last few years, I highly doubt the Storm will ever fly again." He shook his head again. "It's a shame, too. It is clearly superior to the Yanks shuttles. Your unmanned flight in 1988 proved that. If you were to sell it to us, it would still proudly proclaim Russian engineering while giving you a major cash infusion for your other, more important, projects." He looked out the window. "Don't tell anyone I told you, but you might be able to secure an agreement to have 1 or 2 of your cosmonauts participate on all the flights." He glanced back at the director. "And to carry out some maintenance on some of your satellites at no charge." They stared at each other. "At the very least," he said, "you'll recoup nearly half of your investment in the program and pay for quite a few of the others without having to bother the Kremlin for additional funding." He paused a moment. "Having it all in pounds instead of rubles would insulate your budget from the vagaries of inflation, too." Yuri stared at him silently. "We saw your launch last week. Something so small should have been run out of fuel long before leaving the atmosphere." Roderick nodded. "It was a proof-of-concept test," he said amiably. "Now we want to put it to serious use." He gave the other a level look. "We could build our own space plane, but we don't have the infrastructure in place, yet. It would probably take months or years before we had something ready to fly. It would be much cheaper, safer, and faster to purchase the Storm." He leaned forward slightly. "If we can get the Storm for a reasonable price, we'll be on the moon before the fall." He paused. "And so could your cosmonauts." Yuri frowned in thought and studied the ambassador. This is new technology from the Equestrians, isn't it? Roderick smiled. And you aren't going to share it, are you? If you were in our shoes, would you? Roderick replied. The Equestrians, they are happy with you hoarding what you have learned from them, came the incredulous answer. Roderick shook his head. It was their idea, actually. One of the first items they acquired were several dozen histories books. They fear that if everything they knew was freely distributed, the planet would descend into a series of bitter wars. They much prefer that the United Kingdom act as a gatekeeper. He sighed. Their political climate is somewhat similar to the United Kingdom's. We have a parliamentary democracy under a constitutional monarch, they have a constrained nobility with a diarchy. Diarchy? Yes, they are ruled by sister princesses instead of a monarchy, and their nobility operates much like our House of Lords. He smothered a grin. Apparently, the princesses were quite taken with the concept of a House of Commons and are in the process of trying to duplicate it. Just as you would feel more comfortable dealing with a communist country, so they are more comfortable with us, than say, the American Republic or Iraq. The current turmoil in the former Soviet Union states has them uncomfortable at the prospects of keeping the more violent aspects of their technology out of the hands of terrorists or violent states such as Iran and Afghanistan. Apparently, they're using England's response to the introduction of some of their technology as a guideline for what they release in the future. There was a short silence. He stood. I've taken enough of your time, Director. Please give it some thought, and discuss it with your superiors. I'll check back in a week to see if you want to negotiate a fair price. He signed. If we can't come to a quick agreement, I'll have to approach the Yanks for one of their inferior shuttles. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 47. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.